בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב. Uh, we are in I took a one or maybe we have 2 weeks of a break from our regular series this year about the rabbis of the 20th century. And as we are now approaching Hanukkah, and please God, next week would be well within Hanukkah, I thought to give two biographies, not of the great rabbis of the 20th century, but of the great rabbis and warriors of the 300 years before the counting, and that is, of course, the Hasmoneans. And I would like to speak today about Matityahu, and next week, it would be either Yehuda or one of his brothers, as I would decide that it would make most sense. But today we'll speak about Matityahu, who very interestingly, from the angle of what we may call the angle of Chazal, of our sages, he is the only one mentioned by name. All the others, meaning his 5 children, whom we know, Yehuda and Yochanan and Eliezer and Elazar and Shimon and Yonatan, all of these are only known to us from what is called the Sfarim HaChitzoniyim, meaning the external books. The Latin word would be beyond my abilities. Apocryphally. Yeah, so that's the external literature that Chazal chose not to make part of the Tanakh, of what we may call the Jewish canon. And that was an active decision on their side not to include Sefer Maccabean, from which I hope to read with you a little today, was not included by them, as of course not as part of the sacred writings, but it was not even preserved by our sages. They completely forsaken and abandoned this Sefer. It was only preserved to us in its Greek form, although it is more or less agreed by the scholars that it was originally written in Hebrew by one of the Maccabeans, one of the warriors, it seems, a witness to the events of the Hasmonean revolt. And it was written by someone who is Yereh Shamayim, is God-fearing. It's a great religious book. It doesn't necessarily was written with Ruach HaKodesh, so I understand why it did not enter into the Tanakh. But nonetheless, at least from our point of view, it doesn't seem to have any religious problem. Nonetheless, Chazal decided not to keep it, not to copy it, so it was completely lost to the Jewish people and was only preserved, as I said, by the Christians. And all our translations today are made from the Greek form, the Greek translation that was kept by the church. I brought with me my bag. This is a Hebrew version. There are a few Hebrew versions of Sefer Maccabees. We have to know there are 4 Maccabean books. Only one of them is really seen by historians as have a good historical value. The others are later stories, which is very difficult to identify to what extent are they, do they represent anything that really happened in reality. But the first Maccabean book is seen as historically valid. Here, because that's the way that they spelled it in... I would speak about it maybe in a few minutes. It's one of the ways that they spelled it. And there are different versions. That is the Frumer version, you may say. So the translation, at least to my understanding, is more or less accurate as far as a translation from what is itself as a translation. So that's a translation from the Greek, which is itself a translation from some Hebrew source that we do not have. So obviously some information is lost in all of this process of translation. But to my judgment, I compared it with other translations. I don't read Greek, but I compared it with other translations in English and in Hebrew, and it seems accurate enough. Also, he has great notes with references mostly to rabbinic sources, but also to some of the more modern study and research. So it's a very nice edition. That's the one that I personally use. For the purpose of our shiur, I wanted to use some English source. So I'm using here the New English translation that was put to the Shiv'im. That is the name of the Greek version of the Biblica, of the Bible, right? The Tanakh. I would spare from you my attempt to express, to articulate the Spentiguta, right? That's the Septuagint. Septuagint, yeah. That's again, I'm trying to keep myself to the limits of my abilities. So we would use that. Again, I went through that. Of course, everything that comes from Christian sources have to be kept, have to be checked and criticized. To the best of my understanding, the translation again is not diverging too much from what I saw in the Hebrew translation. So it seems that it's kosher v'yosher. That's the introduction. Now, of course, it's an interesting question. Why did Chazal decide not to preserve Sefer Maccabees and not to preserve the names of the 5 children of Matityahu? Matityahu, of course, his name was kept. In Al Hanisim, we mentioned the name of Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. So Matityahu have been given the stamp of approval of the rabbis. His children, for some reason, did not. And the problem is that not only they did not receive this recognition, so their name was completely omitted, it was so omitted that we do not even know why was it omitted. There is no express mentioning of that. We can only assume, and Imir Hashem, I hope to speak about that much more in length next week, but we can only assume that the reason is that as a Kohanim, they shouldn't, it was a mistake on their side to take also the crown, the kingship. When Chachamim tried to stop this encroachment from becoming Kohanim, or this, if you would want, this breach of separation of powers. So when they took also not only the tzitz, not only the position of Kohen Gadol, but also the keter, they took also the crown. Chachamim tried to stand in their way. The result was a purge of the ranks of Chachamim. So Yanai HaMelech and other Hasmonean kings basically murdered and purged. There is a better word that I'm right now missing. Right, so they were ready for persecutions. So they persecuted the sages, the Chachamim, who had to flee. Many of them were killed. And in the end, as we all know, the Hasmonean dynasty was degraded into the kingship of Hordus and the atrocities that accompanied it, and in the end, the final destruction. So Chachamim saw the Hasmonean dynasty as something that maybe began as a good thing, but was corrupted. So the name of the founder of the dynasty, that is Matityahu, was kept, but everyone after him, the children, if his children, were removed from our national memory. That's very short. Of course, as I said, I hope that I'll be able to speak more at length in Mir Hashem next week. But this week, we shall speak about Matityahu. And because Chazal didn't see themselves as historians, then even when they had no problem with Matityahu, it doesn't necessarily mean that they kept the historical record of who was Matityahu and what did he do. So what we have is basically what we have in Al Hanisim. That is, that there was a man named Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. It's so much vague that we are not even sure if the title Kohen Gadol relates really to Matityahu or to his father Yochanan. Because when you say Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Hashmonayi Uvanav, it's not clear. I would add to that, as some of the commentators also noted, that the term Kohen Gadol can be understood in two ways. One is there is a formal position named Kohen Gadol or high priest, and there was only one of them at any given time. He is the Kohen Gadol. However, Kohen Gadol can also be understood and was also used just to say an important Kohen. So he's Gadol, is important, and he's a Kohen, so he was called Kohen Gadol. It doesn't necessarily mean that he fulfilled this specific position of Kohen Gadol in Bet HaMikdash. Now, obviously, that's an opening to a lot of confusion, but what can we do? The sources use the term Kohen Gadol in both ways. So when we are being told that that Matityahu or Yochanan, for that matter, were Kohanim Gdolim, we can doubt whatever it even means that one of them fulfilled the position of a Kohen Gadol in its formal meaning. Now, why do we doubt it? For a very simple reason. Because the Kehuna Gdola, the highly priesthood, at the time of the father of Yehuda Maccabi, that is Matityahu, and the father of Matityahu, Yochanan, it was not a free position. It was a position that was ruled and controlled and managed by who we call the Greeks. Now, to understand what do the Greeks do here in Eretz Israel, we need to begin 100 or a couple, of years, 100 before. And that is from Alexander Mukdon. So Alexander Mukdon, as I guess that we are familiar with, had moved out of the of Greece. Mokdon. The question is Mokdon part of Greece or not is a political question to this very day. So Macedonia. So I'm leaving that aside. But he amassed a large army, and we will call them a Greek army or Hellenistic army. And also he was equipped not only with Greek tactics, but also with Greek philosophy, because his teacher was no other than the great Aristotle. And Alexander is moving with his army, which we know now from historical records that he was not the first to initiate. This army was initiated by his father, Philippus. And he is only continuing in a very young age. He's walking in his father's shoes, but he would prove that he is worthy enough of walking in them. He takes the army and he begins his a journey of conquest, which is, and it can be somewhat compared maybe to the Napoleonic journey, many hundreds of years later. And it's not only a journey of army conquest, but also of cultural conquest. Because everywhere he comes to, he also brings with him these Hellenistic ideas or Greek ideas. But as far as you go from the source, meaning from Greece, then the ideas of Hellenism, of the Greek philosophy or the Greek even mythology that he brings with him is becoming more and more diluted with the local culture, which in time would produce interesting, sometimes very surprising results. In a way, Christianity is one of these results of the meeting between Greek ideas and philosophy and the more the Jewish, but even not the less the idol worshippers' ideas of the Middle East. Out of this mix would grow Christianity, for example. So that's Alexander. Alexander conquers Eretz Israel and continues to the east, to Persia, where he would, in the end, in Persia and in Egypt, and in the end, he would perish. After his death, in very young age, he did all of that very, very young and very, very quick. After he dies, he is not able to, before his death, he is not appointing, at least not in a clear way, anyone that would inherit him. So after his death, his empire, his young empire, immediately falls to the wars of the diadoques, I guess, the generals that fighting after his death for the ruling of his empire. And basically, after the war, the empire is being divided into four. For our purposes, only two are important. One is the house that controls Egypt, called Talmai. And the other one is the house conquering Syria and controlling there, which is called Salvacus, the Selvekim. Now, Eretz Israel, as you know, is in the middle between everything, but also in the middle between Syria and Egypt. So it immediately became a field of combat for these two houses of who would control it. Sometimes it was controlled by the Talmai dynasty, and sometimes it was controlled by the Salvekim. Okay, so that's the background, we may say. After some generations, after some years, there is on the Salveki side, now we'd call them Greek, but as you can understand, they are not so Greek anymore. Some of them maybe have some Greek genes in them, but all of the people that we are going to speak here about, almost all of them were born and raised in Syria. They are Hellenized, but they are not Greek. And one of them, so the current king of the Seleucids, when we speak, Seleucids, that's the word, what word is being used? Seleucids, thank you. So the Seleucids is our friend Antiochus IV, also called Epiphanes, which may mean either the great or the crazy. And he is waging war against the Egyptians, meaning the Talmai house, and he wins some very important victories over them, including taking control of Eretz Israel, Judea, as it was called back then. And he sacks Jerusalem, he takes loot from the Beit HaMikdash, for the temple, but all of that was more or less normal, we may say, to the time and place. However, then he has a new idea. And from this new idea of King Antiochus, we begin. As I said, that's a translation for Maccabees 1. And the king wrote to all his kingdom for all to be as one people, and for each to abandon his own precepts. All the nations complied with the dictum of the king. So we are being told that Antiochus had a great idea. Why should they have what we may call today a multicultural empire? It would be much easier if everyone would have the same beliefs. Then I would be able to have, let's say, a national holiday celebrating my deity, or maybe that I am a deity. These are great ideas. So, says Antiochus to himself, I don't want the Syrians to have their own god, and the Jews to have their own god, and the Phoenicians to have their own god. Let's have all the same culture. Let's be all one. Beautiful idea. He has a dream, right? And in his dream, all human beings are one in the image of Antiochus. And he sends a letter. Obviously, a letter is not only a nice letter asking you, can you please adopt the Hellenistic belief system? We mean here dictums and audience. So all the other nations, in the old translation, it said all the heathens. But it seems to be the more correct translation. All the nations complied with the dictum of the king. Hellenism works. Hellenism works, for sure. And many also from Israel approved of his service and sacrificed to idols and profaned the Shabbat. So that's what we call the Mityavnim. These are the people that accepted the ideas, the Hellenism, accepted and even greeted this opening for the Jews to finally become one with all the other nations. That's a beautiful idea. Why should we be separated? Why should we always be persecuted? Let us become normal as everyone else. So if everyone else is bowing down to Zeus, why wouldn't we as well? And Shabbat, that's a completely useless day. You even cannot walk in it. And the king sent documents carried by the hand of the messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judea for them to follow precepts foreign to the land and to withhold whole burnt offering and sacrifice and libation from the holy precept and to profane Shabbats and feasts and to defile holy persons, and holy ones, to build altars. That's what we know as the Gzeirot of Antiochus. So it's against the Shabbat, it's against eating kosher, it's against learning Torah, and of course it is offering korbanot, sacrifices, to the idols, etc. And leave their sons, of course, uncircumcised, against Brit Milah. To make their souls abominable in every unclean and profane thing, so as to forget the law. The law here is, of course, the Torah, forget the Torah, and to change all the statutes, changing all the laws, all of the mitzvot. So again, you can only imagine what was the original Hebrew. It's very difficult because we have here a translation to English from the Greek, which is a translation from Hebrew. So the word, such a word as Torah, would become something like the law or the commandments, and etc. And whoever would not abide by the command of the king would die. So as I said, that's not just an open invitation, but that is an order with the most dire consequences if you do not follow. According to all of these words, he wrote to all his kingdom and appointed supervisors over all the people and commanded all the cities of Judea to sacrifice city by city. Of course, not to sacrifice the city. The meaning is that in every and each city, there would be a day of sacrifices by which everyone would demonstrate his acceptance of the new idol, the new god of Judea. And many of the people joined them. Everyone who abandoned the law. So many people did abandon the Torah, and they did evil in the land. And they forced Israel into hiding places, meaning the people that wanted to remain faithful to the Torah, which the author here calls Israel, obviously also labeling the people that did not follow the Torah, that succumbed to the orders given by Antiochus, maybe not so Israel. But the people that can be called faithful Jews, they had to run and hide. They forced Israel into hiding places, into every one of their places of refuge. And we know that there were several hiding places, usually in caves or in the deserts, in which the Hasidim, as they were called, were hiding. And then, on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, so it's not Kafei Kislev, it's Tetvav Kislev. We should wait more for Kafei Kislev. So in the 15th of Kislev, the dating here is from Alexander. He constructed an abomination of desolation. Now that's an interesting term. It's an English translation of the Greek, and it's clear that it's a translation of the Hebrew verb, of the Hebrew noun, shikutz meshomam, abomination of desolation. Abomination is shikutz, toeva, and meshumam is desolation. So that's one place in which the Hebrew is hiding, is shining through all of the different forms it is taking here on itself. So that's an avodah zarah, basically. It's an idol. It's a name, a nice name for an idol. So an abomination of desolation on the altar, and in the cities around Judea, they built altars and burned incense at the doors of the houses and in the city squares. And the books of the law, Sifrei Torah, and the books of the law which they found, they tore up and burned with fire. And wherever there was found in someone's possession a book of the covenant, Sefer HaBrit. Now again, does it mean Sefer Torah? Maybe it's some other, maybe it's one, Sefer Dvarim is called sometimes the Sefer HaBrit. So it's difficult to understand here exactly what was the Hebrew original, but obviously we're speaking about some sacred Jewish text. So if they found someone with the Book of Covenant, or if someone was conforming to the law, if someone was following halacha, the judgment of the king put them to death. And they were using their power on those who were found in Israel month by month in the cities. So that's not a persecution of one day, but we are speaking about a process that is going through months and months. And on the 25th of the month, now we are on the 25th of Kislev. Now, maybe some of you expect if it's Kafei Kislev, then of course it's Hanukkah. So the Jews would win, everything is beautiful. No, that's not is what's happening now on Kafei of Kislev. But rather, on the 25th of the month, they were sacrificing all the altar that was on top of the sacrificial altar. That is the day in which they defile the Mizbeach in Beit HaMikdash. So that's a very interesting information piece. Why did the Hasmoneans chose to do Chanukhat HaMikdash, to renew the sacrifices on Kafei Bekislev? Because that was a meaningful day. That was the day in which the Greek, again, we call them the Greeks, had defiled the altar, the Mizbeach in Beit HaMikdash. That would be equivalent, for example, that Be'ezrat Hashem, when Beit HaMikdash would be rebuilt, it would be on Tisha B'Av. And indeed, we have a few Agadetot by Chazal telling us that the Mashiach supposedly is to be born in Tisha B'Av. So this is this idea that you are closing a circle. But however, that's far in the future. Right now, it's the minute of destruction. So the Greeks defile the sacrificial altar in Beit HaMikdash, and the women who had circumcised their children, they put to death according to the ordinance. They hung the babies from their necks, from the mother necks, and put to death their families and those who circumcised them. So that's, I think that speaks volumes. I don't need to explain. Just I would note one extremely interesting thing that was pointed by rabbis and by researchers, and that is that it is clear that they were the women that were pushing for milah, for circumcision, even in the face of danger of death. Because it could have said, and the fathers that circumcised their children, but it's not what is being said here. It's being said that it were the women, the mothers, that were willing to risk their life, their own life, and the life of the children in order to keep with milah, which is, I think, again, it's something that there is almost nothing that we can comment about, just something to keep in our hearts. So I continue. But many in Israel remained strong and fortified themselves not to eat common things, meaning not to eat unkosher things, we would say, and they preferred to die so as not to be contaminated by food and not to defile the Holy Covenant. And indeed, they died. They did not just prefer to die, but that's what really materialized. That's what did happen. And it was a very great wrath upon Israel. So that is the background for the story of Matityahu. I would guess that we are all more or less familiar with the story, but I think reading it, again, from someone that, according to all studies, was really living through it. So that's an eyewitness account. At least for me, it makes the things much more real. So it was important for me to share this text with you. Now, let's continue and see our hero, Matityahu. In those days, Matityahu, so that's the Latin form, Matityahu, son of Johannes, that is Yochanan for us. So I would use, I would apologize, but I would use the Hebrew form. So Matityahu ben Yochanan, himself the son of Shimon, Matityahu ben Yochanan, son of Shimon, a priest of the sons of Yohariv. We know that the Kohanim were divided into 24 companies, or what would be batei, houses of families. So one of them was Yohariv. Some of you may be familiar with the name Yohariv because we have a kina on Tisha B'Av listing all the names of the houses of Kehuna and their cities. So Yohariv and Matityahu left Yerushalayim and settled in Modi'in. As a Kohen, he used to live in Yerushalayim. However, as the temple was defiled and he didn't want to take part in the Hellenized form of worship that now was done in Bet HaMikdash, many of the Kohanim did succumb and surrender to these Hellenistic forces. As a matter of fact, it seems that at least in certain times, it's difficult to give general statements here. But we know that in certain times, the Kohanim were more prone to the Hellenistic influence than other layers of society. It's an interesting phenomenon. But we know also from other peoples and from other times in history that many times the highest echelons of society are more susceptible for external influence. Because if you are, you don't have to be poor, but you're just, your local guy in some village, then you tend to be more national, more maybe religious, more traditional. However, if you have good education, which exposes you to other cultures, and you have enough money to maybe buy things from Chutz La'aretz, from outside of Eretz Israel, maybe you even have enough money in order to make a trip abroad and to see things outside, then that would put you in a position that would be much more open to be influenced by the outside. Now, that is not necessarily negative. If you are able to import what is good and to reject what is bad, then that is a very important role of the high society. However, if instead you begin I'm trying to choose my words carefully. But if you begin maybe to detest your own heritage and you see all the good only is what is outside, then that is catastrophic. And it seems that what happens to the Kohanim, at least in certain times, again, it's very dangerous to try and generalize from what we know about an age which may be 100 years after the events that have been described here, and to project it into 1 year earlier. We know that in 100 years, many things can change. However, that seems to be just a fact of life and society, which is, as I said earlier, that higher higher layers in society, as I said, would be more open to external influence. Okay, so some of the Kohanim played with, according to the roll book of Antiochus. However, not Matityahu. So Matityahu left Yerushalayim and settled in Modi'in. As we know, it's not so far away. So he settled in Modi'in, and he had 5 sons. Yohanan, who was called Gadi. That's interesting. So he had a nickname. So his name was Gadi. Shimon, who was called the Tassi. Yehuda, who was called, of course, Maccabee. So this is the word Maccabee that we are using here. Obviously, it was not the name of the family. The name of the family was Hasmonean. So it was not Maccabee. Maccabee is the nickname of Yehuda. After Yehuda became an extremely important man, then the name Maccabee was also given to the whole of the family. What does this word mean? That's a very good question, which is unclear because we only know it, we don't know it from rabbinic sources. It's only known from this Greek source, which again, it was Hebrew in the original, but how can we know what was the original word that was being used? And part of the question is, what I was asked earlier, do we use a kuf or a kaf? We are used to the form Maccabee, as in Maccabi Tel Aviv. And some have even suggested that that's an acronym. It's Rashi Tevot of Maccabee, Mi Kamocha Ba'elim Hashem. Nice, but no real evidence that that is the meaning of the name. Others suggested that Maccabee in Kuf comes from the word Makevet. The word Makevet means a great hammer, a sledgehammer maybe, that you use in fight. So they suggested that Yehuda was using a Makevet, a slave. He was not fighting with a sword necessarily, but he was known for his use of the sledgehammer during war. And that was why he was called Maccabee. Again, an interesting proposition, no evidence whatsoever. Each one of you can maybe suggest his own suggestion. It would be as good as any educated historian would say, because that must be also be admitted, and that is a history is more of an art than a science. So that's what we know. Some even suggest that the real word is not Maccabee. It can be either with a kaf and kaf, but Makkevai, or the Makvai. What exactly would be the meaning of that? Also open. As I say, here is interesting suggestions by rabbinical sources and by historians, but all of them in the end are pure assumptions. So we continue. El-Azar was called the Awaran, and Yonatan would call a fool. So each one of them has the nickname. Now, was that the minhag then to give nickname to every one? Or is it part of the revolt? We know that in underground organizations, in order to keep secrecy, then it's very customary to give nicknames. Who knows? Again, that's an information that we just do not possess.
Well, that's a nice name.
Maybe, but some of them seem to be Hebrew. Yeah, Maccabee does not seem to be Hellenistic in origin. So it seems to be that that was the Hebrew nickname. But again, it's very difficult to know what was the original Hebrew name and what was its meaning. So he saw the blasphemies occurring in Yehuda and in Yerushalayim and said, and here again, we have to know that in the Greek word, and here we can maybe also include the writer of the Hebrew original, it was very well a custom that if you write a history, you have some free license in quotations. Meaning you can quote someone and beautify his words. That would be the easiest translation. But sometimes if you do not use his words, but you know what he should have said, you're also allowed to just write what you think you would have said if you would just have the opportunity. So that's just what we are facing, where there is no way to bypass it. So I have a quote of, seems to be a word by word, said by Matityahu. I have no way to know, obviously he didn't speak in English, but also not in Greek. But we cannot even be sure that there was an original speech given by him. However, it seems to be close enough to his figure that we can get whatever information we can get. I would just say that when Josephus, for example, 200 years after the story of the Maccabees, but he also writes an history, and the very well-known story about Metzada, and the very famous, great last speech of Eliezer ben Yair, right there on Metzada, speaking about how it's better to die than to fall prey and become slaves of the Romans. Everyone died after. How did Josephus got the speech? He says that two women went into the sewers and were hiding there, and then they came out and they told him a word by word the speech that Elazar gave. I leave it to your judgment about the validity of this argument. So as I said, well, that's just an obstacle that we have. If I would have another source, which is a verb time quotation of what Matityahu said, and obviously I would have used it. I don't have. So we just use what we have with this warning joined to it. Woe to me! Why was I born to see this? Says Matityahu. The destruction of my people and the destruction of the holy city. And they lived there when it was delivered into the hands of the enemies, the holy precinct into the hands of the foreigners. And the shrine became as a man. Here he gives a correction. He says that it should be, the right version is, as a house of a man without honor, because the temple is not a man. The temple is the house of a man without a honor. The vessels of her glory, meaning Klei Hamikdash, were taken captive. Her infants were killed in the city squares, her young people by the sword of an enemy. What nation did not possess her in its kingdom, nor seize her spoils? All her adornments were removed. From being free, she became a slave. And look, our holy places, that is the temple, our beauty and our glory were devastated, and the nations defiled them. Why is there still life in us? Meaning it is better death than our situation, says Matityahu. And as Matityahu and his sons tore their garments and put on sackcloth and mourned intensely, and the agents, so all of that happening in Modi'in because they fled Jerusalem and came to Modi'in. And the agents of the king who were enforcing the apostasy came to the city of Modi'in to sacrifice, meaning to sacrifice to idols. And many from Israel came to them. So many again joined the Mityavnim, the Hellenizers, joined the officers of the king. And Matityahu and his sons gathered together. And the agents of the king answered and said to Matityahu, because he was one of the Kohanim, so he was an important man, he was Kohen Gadol. I mean, was he a high priest? Was he an important priest? It doesn't matter. He was an important man. Obviously, if he would sacrifice to the idols, all the others would follow suit. So he is the one that is being pushed by the officer of the king, the soldier, saying, you are a ruler, both glorious and great in the city, and supported by sons and brothers. That's what the soldier, the officer, says to Matityahu. Now you come forward first and execute the ordinance of the king, as have done all the nations and the men of Judea, and those remaining in Jerusalem. And you and your sons will be among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be glorified with silver and gold and much compensation. So he tries to buy him. That's very on the table, right? Trying to corrupt Matityahu, just he hit the wrong guy. So, and Matityahu answered and said with a loud voice, if all the nations which are in the realm of the king obey him so as to apostatize, each one from the religion of their fathers, and adopt his commandments, both I and my sons and my brothers would walk in the covenant of our fathers. So anyone else may follow your new gods. Not me, not my sons, not my brothers. God help us if we abandon the law and the statutes. So he says, that is a language of an oath in Hebrew. That may God help us, that's a language of an oath. He's taken an oath that he would not leave the Torah and halacha. We will not obey the words of the king, nor deviate from our religion to the right or to the left. Obviously, he's expressing here a pasuk from the Torah. Lo tasur mimeno yamin usmol. So again, the Hebrew shines here through all of the forms that he took. And he finishes speaking these words. As he finished speaking these words, Matityahu, a Judean man came within sight of all to sacrifice on the altar. So there was a person there, we don't know his name, and he says, okay, you don't want the offer by the king, I will take it. Give the money to me, and I will sacrifice. In accordance with the ordinance of the king. And Matityahu saw this, and he became zealous, and his kidneys became stirred up. Now, that's, again, obviously some translation of an Hebrew coin. It may be, they suggest, Vekiliotav ishtonenu. That's from Tehillim. So his kidneys were moved. He was moved. His inner were moved. And his anger arose in judgment. And running, he slaughtered him, meaning the Judean man, the first one to die in the revolt was not a Greek soldier. He was an Hellenizer that wanted, it's very important to understand that in a sense, most and foremost, the revolt was also a civil war. So he slaughtered this man on the altar and killed the agent of the king, also the king's officer. He also killed, who was forcing them to sacrifice at the time, and tore down the altar. And he became zealous in the law. He became Kanai Torah as a Pinchas. That's Pinchas, right? So Pinchas, as we all know, has killed Zimri ben Salu in Arvot Moab, in the Shittim, had done against Zambri. I have no idea why they translated it as Zambri, but it's Zimri, of course, the son of Salu. And Matityahu cried out in the city with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous in the law and is upholding the covenant follow me." That's the first chidush, we may say, of Matityahu. He kills the Jew. Now, killing the Greek soldier, that again, he was a Greek, was a Syrian, it doesn't really matter. But killing the Gentile soldier was one thing. Killing the Jew was a complete separate thing. And that is, I can almost say, a chidush halacha made by Matityahu. Now, Matityahu give you his proof text. What is his proof text? Text proof text, right? So what is it? Pinchas. He says, I am following the footsteps of Pinchas. He was also a Kohen, and he killed Zimri ben Salu as an act of zealotry. And that is what I am doing now. Now, of course, we must understand that every time you activate the zealotry mode, that is not something that can be done on a daily basis. We can all understand that, because that means the complete destruction of any judicial system. The founding stones, the pillars of any judicial system is that you do not kill on the street people that committed a crime, but you bring them to justice. You can only commit zealotry where the judicial system completely fell out of use. So what Matityahu really is doing here by killing this man that came and advanced in order to sacrifice to the idols, he is saying the Jewish system of law is inactive anymore, and we need to restart it. That is a push of a button of restarting. So we are outside of the regular realm of halacha. Because in the regular realm of halacha, you do not walk around with a sword and kill people that according to you are committed a crime. There is a very long and exact process, which usually really you cannot really execute. You need two witnesses, you need a warning, then you need to bring him to the court, and you need to try him in the court, and you need 23 dayanim. All of that obviously did not happen here. So that is an act of zealotry. And by that, Matityahu really, we may say, is declaring an emergency situation, a matzav chirum. And Matityahu cried out in the city with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous in the law and is upholding the covenant follow me." That's what we know as mi laHashem elai, in short. Everything that you put in Greek or in English becomes immediately 3 sentences. But in Hebrew, it's very short. Mi laHashem elai. Everyone who is zealous in the law and is upholding the covenant follow me. And his sons fled to the mountains and abandoned everything they had in the city. Obviously, they were willing to sacrifice everything for their faith and their belief. At the time, many were seeking righteousness and judgment, descended to the wilderness to live there. They, their sons, their wives, and their livestock, because evils worsened upon them. So if you wanted to remain a faithful Jew, you cannot remain to live in the city or in the village, because where the king's people were positioned, then you were forced into Aveira, into transgression against the halacha. So people that wanted to remain faithful had to flee to the wilderness, to the deserts, to the caves. And it was announced to the king's men and to his forces that were in Yerushalayim, the city of David. You see here how he's He's trying to tell us something, right? The writer of the book. Yerushalayim, the city of David, had now fallen into the hands of Antiochus and his men. And he says that the men who were spun the commandment of the king went into hiding in the wilderness, and many chased after them, so many soldiers were sent after. Now, these people didn't want to revolt. The people that went to they just wanted to be left to practice their beliefs. But Antiochus knew that if he would let them keep the fire burning, then in the end it would reignite the whole of Judea. You have to completely extinguish. Exactly. Or at least you the Nesrine, you mean without Yahadut. So many chased after them, and overtaking them, marshaled against them and engaged them in battle on the day of the Shabbat. So the Greeks knew that if they want to have an easy victory, they should wage war on Shabbat, because the Hasidim who fled, they fled to the desert in order to keep the Shabbat. They would not break the Shabbat. So they waged war intentionally against them on Shabbatot. And they said to them, enough. So the soldiers said to the Jews hiding in the caves, enough, come out and do according to the dictum of the king, and you will live. And they, being the Hasidim, said, we will not come out, nor will we execute the dictum of the king to defy the day of the Shabbat. And they increased the battle against them. But they so the Greeks began to combat. But they, meaning the Hasidim, neither answered them, not threw a stone against them, nor even secured their hiding place. So they remained completely passive in order not to break the Shabbat, saying, let us all die in our, here it says simplicity, it means temimut, not simplicity in the meaning of simpleton, but in the meaning of purity. Thank you. That's a much better word. So let us stay in our pureness. What they mean, let's continue, then I would explain. Heaven and earth bear witness to us. Shamayim va'aretz. So again, that's an Hebrew verse. Heaven and earth bear witness to us, edim shamayim va'aretz, that you destroy us unjustly. And they fell upon them in battle on the Shabbat, and they and their wives and their children and their livestock died, as many as 1,000 human souls. Now, why did they do that? We all know that there is an halacha that on Shabbat you are allowed to fight. God knows how many Shabbatot I don't want even to say desecration. I don't think it's a desecration, but I fought just this year. So why didn't they fight back? That's a good question. Let's continue and see. And Matityahu and his friends learned of this, and they mourned over them greatly. And they said as a man to his neighbor, if we all do as our brothers did, and do not fight against the nations for our lives and our statues, now quickly they will annihilate us from the land. And they decided that on the day saying, every person who comes against us in battle, even on the day of Shabbat, let us fight against them. And we will not all die as our brothers died in the hiding places. So first chidush we saw of Matityahu is the killing of the Jew. The second seems to be a contradiction. It seems not an act of zealotry, but an act of temperance, right? Of pshara, of making with reality, making peace with reality. We have to fight on Shabbat and to break the law. What is going on here? I will try to explain, and here I rely on Rav Tzvi Neria and a small booklet that he written 60 years ago, called Milchamot HaShabbat. And there he writes the following. Why didn't the Hasidim fight back on Shabbat? We have in the Tanakh testimonies, and for example, Yoshua encircled Jericho for 7 days. So it is clear that he fought on Shabbat. 7 days must include Shabbat. So that was a well-known practice that we do fight on Shabbat. that on pikuach nefesh, one is allowed to do melacha on Shabbat. So what was going on there? And he says, they didn't see fighting back as a viable option. They would have died anyway. They had been with their women, with their children, with their livestock. It was not a real option to fight. They were going to lose. So they preferred, as it says here, to stay in their pureness. If we would lose anyway, then better let us not desecrate the Shabbat. That was their line of thinking. The chidush of Matityahu, what Matityahu added, and it is basically the same point that he did when killing the Jew, trying to sacrifice on the altar. He said, it's time for us to wake up. It's not only a question anymore of a singular individual or maybe 1,000 individuals being forced into breaking the Shabbat, and then we say it's better maybe to die than to break the Shabbat. No. We are now, he declared war. That is basically what he did. It's not up till his announcement, then they all acknowledged that the governor of the land is Antiochus. So basically, he is the power, and he has the power of killing. Now, he may do things unjustly, but still is being seen as the legitimate government. However, what Matityahu done by announcing the revolt, and that was an extremely important development, he said, we do not see Antiochus anymore as legitimate government. So from now on, we are in, as I said, emergency state. So we are in war. And in war, it's not if a goy comes to me and says, either you break the Shabbat or die, and it's the context of what we call gzerot shmad, of trying to convert the Jews, then it is better even to die and not to be converted. However, when we speak about these questions, should I transgress or should I die, we do not even arise the option of fighting back. So that was the greatness of Matityahu. He was able to make this switch and to say, from now on, we are not anymore passive. Given our choices by the foreign ruler, from now on, we make our own rules and decisions. So we are waging war. In a sense, it's similar not only to Pinchas, but to Moshe Rabbeinu. Because for the Jews enslaved in Egypt, they didn't see even an option to open in a revolt. It was all a question of how do we manage the slavery. And when he began to speak about maybe going away, they told him, what are you doing? You are destroying us because now Paro would punish us bitterly, severely. They could not even fathom what he was speaking about, but becoming free people. It was beyond their imagination after being enslaved for 200 years. And what Matityahu is doing here is of the same order. He's taking people that for them, the two options were either to be, you can die, or you can follow the king's laws and orders. So this is your two possibilities, your two options. So if you are a tzaddik, then you die. And if you are not so tzaddik, maybe, then you Hellenize. Says Matityahu, no, we have a third option. We can hit back. We can wage war, and we can win. That is a crucial moment. And by that, he's also saying we are, from now on, we return to being a nation. Not only individuals controlled by some other nation, we are a sovereign nation. If we are a sovereign nation, that we need to punish our own traitors. That's what he's doing with the men that came to sacrifice. And we also are allowed to fight back, as I said, during Shabbat. As we will see, my time is up. So, you know what? Let's continue with the story of Hashmonai. Be'ezrat Hashem, next week, we'll continue with Matityahu finish the story of Matityahu, and then continue to the story of one of his sons to the extent to be able. I do think that that's a worthwhile study before Hanukkah and in Hanukkah. So we'd stop here at this very crucial moment in which Matityahu really declares war. So what does war means? Bezrat Hashem, next week.